All right, so we're in ninth lit, and we're reviewing for Canterbury Tales. And the first question, wasn't a question, it says study the PowerPoint notes, especially the daily questions. So I didn't think it was necessary that you rewrite all the PowerPoint notes, but I think you should look at them. So get them out just to see what kinds of things you're supposed to study. I think sometimes I've heard students kind of make assumptions about things, like, I didn't think we're supposed to do this or that, and that's what we're trying to, one thing I'm trying to teach when it comes to reading. We think we've read it, but we really didn't, so we make assumptions. You just need to make sure you study anything written. You should study very carefully. So what are some of the things, if you look at the daily questions that you have, and I can ask you without, maybe you can answer these without looking. What were Chaucer's occupation and avocation in life? Occupation and avocation. Yes.
For the occupation, didn't he work under the king, like in the royal court?
So he was we could say he was a bureaucrat. He was a civil servant. You know, people that work for the government used to be called in America civil servants. Your letter carrier, your mail carrier, that used to be under the government. I think it's a private business now, but contracted by the government. But they were civil servants. It was a civil servant exam. That's what Chaucer did for a living. That was his job until he was in his late 40s, something like that. Then he died at 60. I think he died at 60. Yeah, 1340, 1400. So somewhere in his 40s, he retired, 46 maybe, and so the last 14 years. What was his avocation, which he focused on the last 14 or so years? What was it?
One of the three greatest English authors.
Yeah, in his extra time, his spare time, he became one of the three greatest English authors. Isn't that pretty good? You know, you didn't even do it full time. You were just kind of doing it half time, and you made it in the top three. You practice basketball you don't spend a lot of time on it, yet you're one of the top three players in North Carolina. Yeah, I could become the best player in North Carolina if I spent my entire time on it. So avocation and occupation. Avocation and vocation. Vocation and occupation mean the same thing. And you also answered how important is Chaucer. That's one way to put it. What's another way to put it? He's one of the three great writers of the English literature. There's another way you could show how important he was. Anybody see it? You don't have to remember it, but if it's in your notes, I'd like to hear what you've got. What's the other way you could describe Chaucer's importance? He was the first great writer in English literature. He's at the beginning of the canon of British literature. Canon means the approved list. You know, this is the list of great authors. He is at the very beginning. Before him, there wasn't one great author. Now there was. Can anybody name another work that he wrote? Because you're going to have to Wednesday. What? Well, take a look at that list. We're not reading them, and I've read them actually, and of course, I'll let you look at that list. Do you have it, Sarah?
Chaucer's work. Translated Romance de la Rose.
All right, the Romance de la Rose, or Romance of the Rose. It was a translation. He didn't write it. He translated Boethius, I believe, Consolation of Philosophy. Anything he wrote himself, yes.
The Book of Duchess.
Yes, and I remember reading that. I think I told you, I don't see my book over there. But I remember reading those in college and not having a lot of interest in it. You know, when I started, like, I just have to take the course. And I can remember enjoying it. I think the Lord was trying to confirm that I was in the right business, because I didn't think, why would anybody want to read? I never heard of him hardly before. and I enjoy this obscure piece of literature that I have to translate, and I enjoy it. Anyway, that's how it was for me. You need to know the dates of the Canterbury Tales and when they were published. You got those in front of you? Yes, Charlotte.
They were written between 1386 and 1400s, and they
Okay,
were written.
1386 to 1400.
And they were written at the time of his death, and it remained unfinished.
That's correct, very good. Now, when were they published?
By William Caxton in 1407.
Right, and there's not a particular day, I didn't give you a date, just in the 1470s, and so it was one of the first major works printed by a printing press, and so that was significant. Explain the framework of the Canterbury Tales. These are all your daily questions. Anybody want to explain the framework? It's a framework story. So you'd have to be able to define it and explain it. Anybody know what a framework story is? Jeff, sorry.
It's a religious pilgrimage to the Cathedral of Canterbury.
Can you explain how that makes it a framework story? How does that work? Like, what is a framework story? You're correct, but you need to explain it. Yeah, go ahead.
It's like a collection of tales bound together.
All right.
sort of.
That's true too. Charlotte, what were you gonna say?
Stories within stories.
Right, I mean, it's like literally a frame. Here's a frame. And that frame is the pilgrimage to Canterbury. And then within the frame, there's the friar's tale, and there's the physician's tale, and there's the nun's priest tale. So the outer frame, like a picture, is the pilgrimage. Within it are these tales, these stories inside by different people. That's how it worked. How many tales did Chaucer write? How many stories are in the Canterbury Tales? We read 3. Only Charlotte and Sawyer know these answers, so we'll go with Sawyer.
120, is that right?
That was what he intended, or that's how many he wrote?
He wrote 24 before he died.
Right. And if you take the host seriously as an indication of what Chaucer had in mind, that would have added up to 120. I personally don't believe he would have tried to write that many. But it may have been just part of the story, you know, that they were going to do 120, and he wouldn't tell every one of them. But clearly he died before he finished, so we don't really know, except for that, how many more he planned. What are some of the different genres and subjects of the tales? There are about 9 different. Sarah, give me some.
Romance.
Which means adventure. The Knight's Tale was an example of that. Baglow, the Miller's Tale, kind of a dirty story, or, you know, has bad words in it. It doesn't really have any bad words in it, but that's an example of that.
Beast epic.
Nun's Priest Tale, the Beast Epic.
Classical legends.
Yeah, we didn't read any of those, but you got any others? What? Yep, she just mentioned that, classical kind of Beast Tale, yeah.
The Saint's Life.
Right, so kind of a biography.
Emblem. Explem.
Yeah, something that's used for a sermon illustration. You know, like you go to your pastor probably tells a few stories to illustrate what he's trying to get at. Yeah.
Sermon, tragedy, miracle of the Virgin.
So I'm going to ask you some of the, particularly the first 3 that Sarah mentioned, because we read one of each of those. Beast Fable, What was the other two?
Romance.
The romance, we didn't read that, but we know about that. What was the third one that you meant, first three?
Newspaper?
Yeah, what was the first one?
Pablo.
Right, the Fableau. We didn't read that either, but we know an example. So those would be three to particularly remember because we know three stories that conform to that. One of the things about the tales that's always made it so popular is its variety. There are 24 stories and none of them are alike. You read O. Henry, and I like O. Henry. You know, he's a good Greensboro boy. His stories, they have this formula. You know, same type of people usually take place in New York City. Sometimes an ex-criminal, and then at the end there's this twist. All the stories follow that pattern, but you can't say that about the Canterbury Tales. Each story kind of is a different world in itself, which makes it the work of a genius. It just proves that it's a work of a genius. All right. All right, what are the importance and reputation of the prologue? Yes.
It shows medieval English culture, and then like the pilgrims had clarity in the prologue, and they're like normal people, and then they are like representative of like the average people in England, like men and women.
So you said two things. The second one is that the characters are like, they're all unique, and yet they all represent, they're all kind of stereotyped in the same way. That seems like impossible. You can't be a stereotype and unique. But that's sort of what he accomplishes. So you got the parson, he represents really good parsons. And you get the friar, and he represents really bad friars. And yet there's something about each one of the characters in the prologue that stands out. I remember the cook. There's very little about the cook except he has some sore on his knee. And so there's something about each character that's unique. What about the skipper? What was the one thing we said about the skipper? He was a pretty good sailor, captained his ship. But what is one thing to me it stood out? I made that point, yeah.
Oh, that he like killed people, like he was ruthless?
Yes, he had, I forget how I put it, but he ignored the typical morals of society. In other words, he killed his prisoners, if he had any. Do you remember the Reeve? Remember the Reeve? I'll give you a hint that he's the old guy that did the same job as the Manciple. But you remember something about the Reeve?
He was like illiterate and didn't have good.
That was the Manciple.
Oh.
That's all right, that's important too. So that was the thing about the Manciple. Guy couldn't read or write, except he was a great steward. Do you remember anything about the Reeve that stood out? He was so good. Well, first of all, he was thin and he was wealthy. That was unheard of. If you were wealthy, you were large. Plus, he was so wealthy that he loaned his boss money. You know, his boss is the guy paying him, right? And yet he was so wealthy because he saved his money that he would pay it, he would actually loan some of it or give some of it to his boss. So that's one thing you need to do, which is the question number 2. We already sort of did that. You need to go back through that list. These especially, you need to know all the occupations. For instance, do you know what a Franklin is? You need to know what a Franklin is. You know what a reeve and a yeoman is. You're going to have to define yeoman, Franklin, reeve, manciple, summoner, squire. So these are jobs that you need. I might even throw in haberdasher because you didn't know that, although we didn't read anything specific about him. But that's a job. You know, remember what a haberdasher is? Yeah, Ben. Right, and accessories. That's why eventually it became known as a man who sold hats. Because that's what I always thought it was. A haberdasher is the guy, not just men, probably even women's hats, but that's not, it was a really bigger job than that. If you were a haberdasher, you sold clothing, men's clothing. And so you need to look at a Franklin and I just went through that, be able to define them, and characteristics of them, yes.
What's a Franklin?
Anybody remember what a Franklin is? Taylor?
A landowner, but not noble.
Yes. What is a yeoman? And I'm asking that because it's kind of, you can associate with a Franklin.
Man who owned a small farm.
So Franklin was a bigger job, it was a bigger title. You owned a bigger, probably, amount of land, a yeoman smaller. And what did the yeoman in our story always have in common? There was a yeoman who was the devil, and there was a yeoman who was one of the pilgrims. What did they both have in common?
They like good clothes.
You're ready for this test, would you like to go ahead and take it? I don't think you're gonna need to study much. Good, he was like Robin Hood, they were foresters. I was reading a book recently, and he talked about a division of yeomen was gonna be sent to France to fight, and I thought, yeomen, we know about yeomen. That's that group of people in England who own, they're small farmers. Farmers who farm small farms. All right, so look at that list. Any of those you don't recognize? We didn't read the woman of Bath, but there were probably 8 or 10 things that we said about the woman of Bath. The same thing with the parson. There were about 10 or 12 things we said about him. I'm probably not gonna ask you to tell me 10 things about him, but that's one way you should study that.
Like, what would you consider like the job of like the squire?
What is a squire? You should know that from history.
He like helps knight.
All right, that's what it is. Now, what did we know about that particular squire?
And he's the knight's son.
Right.
And he's like, he's tall and strong, he's like really, charming. He gets
I couldn't hear that last part.
like he's tall, charming, strong, and he gets like, all the girls like him, he plays instruments and sports and stuff.
Good. Anything else? Taylor, do you have anything you got? Anything else? What did we say, another word that could describe it?
Venice.
What?
Like a Renaissance.
How is he a Renaissance man?
Cause he's like, kinda like has like all the attributes of, and was like, has like the romance part to him, cause he can like sing and stuff, but he also like cares about like chivalry and stuff like that.
And what else did he care about?
He was athletic and good at.
Athletic, and he could kill you if he had to, because he's in the military. That's a Renaissance man. Again, think about, do we have any Renaissance men in this classroom that you can sing, you're in the band, and you play a sport, and you're a valedictorian? All right. That would be an example of a Renaissance man. And ladies, I suppose it works the other way around, except that phrase usually referred to men. But I think it seems like the last several years, like I can't even remember, all the valedictorians were girls. What's up with that? Well, I think it's obvious they're smarter than we are, guys. But it seems like every now and then there should be a guy that could win that thing. But we're proud of the ladies, and that's true. It's just really true. That more often than not, it's the girls who are the ones that are. But a Renaissance man would be the guy that would be up there academically, athletically, and every other way. So you see any of that list, you need to study that. I mean, I think you're a little complacent because you got 48 hours. Go for it. But if you want to wait the last minute, they can do that too. I don't recommend it.
Number 3, I got like what's the importance of the road, but what makes it a cross section?
All right, that's a good question. Let's go on to number 3. We talked about the variety of the Canterbury Tales, but what about the prologue itself? I think somebody said it. I don't remember what. Maybe it was Daniel, but somebody made a comment about it earlier that was true. I don't remember. Anybody remember? Well, I think. But first of all, we have a variety of characters. Not only a variety of tales, but a variety of characters. And how would you describe that variety? Well, they all do different jobs. And because the fact that I'm going to ask you to know what these jobs are, to this day, shows you how important jobs are to people. Our pastor yesterday was talking about not finding our identity in our work. He doesn't mean that totally, because it is true that we get identity. I'm a teacher. That people ask, what do you do for a living? I'm a teacher. I don't say, I don't tell them my beliefs. I don't tell them, when you say, what do you do? One of the things that identifies you, but we shouldn't put, that's not really all who I am. It's just a job that I've had for 45 years. But it's still true to human nature that we identify people by their jobs. That's why work is so important. If you don't have work, it takes from you one of those huge ways to figure out who we are. Can you think of any other thing, if you look at that list in number 2, any other way that you could describe the pilgrims? Different jobs, but what other way? What's the obvious? Male and female, yeah.
Or maybe like daily life, or like society, like how everyone like lives differently. Cause like, I mean, it's their job to like do stuff, but like, it's like every single person is different, I guess.
Right, and some of the ways they're different, we mentioned male and female, but I think you're also suggesting age. Were you gonna say that? You got the squire who's a teenager, and you got his father who's a veteran, combat veteran. You know, he's like probably in 40s or 50s, yeah.
Different like classes of society.
For instance,
You have like the woman of bats, and then you have like the friar who begs for a living.
very good. Those two also describe what other difference categories that you have.
Morals?
Definitely morals. You got the parson, who would be the opposite of the parson? Oh,
This,
Friar,
any of those guys.
Sumner.
The Sumner, the friar, the miller, but the plowman and the parson were like exceptionally moral people. And one huge difference, some are clerical, or not clerical, but ecclesiastical, whatever you want to call it. Some work for the church, that's the clergy, and some don't. What do you call the people that don't work for the church?
Gentiles.
That's good. That's not exactly what Gentiles are, but I like that answer. Gentiles would be non-Jewish people. That you can be a king and not be Jewish, you'd still be a Gentile. Caesar Augustus was Gentile. Judas Iscariot was a Jew. All right, clergy versus laity, L-A-I-T-Y. Those words were on the board for weeks, for several weeks.
wait, how do you spell it?
L-A-I-T-Y, clergy. That's a Y. The laity is anybody that doesn't work for the church. Now, that's not exactly right, because you could work for the church and not be clergy. Like one of my sons, well, both my sons at one time served as youth leaders, but they weren't ordained ministers. So even though they were youth directors, they were still laymen. The only person in your church member who's really a clergyman or woman would be those people that have gone to seminary, and still that doesn't do it. You have to be ordained by some governing group. But you could divide these people into good and bad, rich and poor, old and young, clergy and laity. There are lots of contrast here. So between now and Wednesday, I'm glad we spent this time today because we've had lots of interruptions last week. You need to review those lists. We got down to number 3. Number 4 is easy, and number 5 is easy because we only read 3 tales. But you need to know those 3 tales really well. And yes,
What's a clergy?
Clergy are people that are ordained in the church to, just to be ordained, which means you have a special calling on you, and you've been confirmed by a group. That's the clergy. What I'm saying is, although we're calling them clergy, some of these people aren't. Friars, I don't think they're clergy, but they work for the church. So maybe that's a better way to say it. The church versus the non-church is a division you have.
What would be like the Miller, doesn't he like do like at a grinds things like wheat and stuff?
Yeah.
So like what would be one of his like attributes for that person?
Remember him, and we'll finish with this. Anybody remember the yeah.
He was really good at stealing grain.
He's a cheater. He's dishonest. He loved to fight in bars. He liked to tell dirty stories. He played the bagpipes. He was big. There's a lot of things about him. All right, so we will see you tomorrow.